The carrier was immobile at 2:04 a.m. when the destroyer received the escort assignment, and it would remain immobile for the duration of the engagement. Immobile was not a metaphor. The carrier had sustained a YJ-18 anti-ship missile strike 47 minutes earlier that had detonated in the engineering spaces, disabling 2 of 4 propulsion shafts and flooding the port engine room. The carrier was capable of 6 knots on its remaining propulsion. Not enough to maneuver operationally, not enough to generate apparent wind for flight operations, barely enough to maintain steerage. It was sitting, essentially stationary, in the South China Sea, 280 nautical miles east of the Luzon Strait. The carrier was not undefended. Its own close-in defensive systems were intact. 2 CIWS mounts, Sea Sparrow launchers, and its air wing, if the flight deck could be cleared sufficiently for launch operations. But the flight deck had taken fragment damage from the YJ-18 detonation, and the deck crew was working under emergency conditions to restore sufficient launch capability for the remaining combat-capable aircraft. The air wing could not launch for an estimated 40 to 60 minutes. For those 40 to 60 minutes, the 5,000 crew members aboard the carrier and the 68 aircraft on its deck were defended by one thing. The destroyer, positioned 2.8 nautical miles off the carrier's port beam, ordered to hold position and provide air defense coverage for the duration. The weight of that sentence was not lost on anyone in the carrier's command structure or in the destroyer's CIC. The carrier had its own defensive systems. The CIWS mounts were operational. The Sea Sparrow launchers were loaded. Against a saturation engagement of 60 contacts, those systems provided a terminal layer only. Everything beyond 2 kilometers of the carrier's hull required the destroyer's weapons inventory. The escort was not a secondary defensive measure. For the next 40 to 60 minutes, it was the primary one. The destroyer could not maneuver freely. The carrier was stationary. The protection geometry required the destroyer to maintain close proximity to cover the carrier with its defensive envelope. Maneuvering away from the carrier, even to optimize the defensive arc for an incoming threat, would create coverage gaps around the carrier's hull that no weapon system could fill from distance. The destroyer had to stay close. Close meant 2.8 nautical miles, which meant any threat that penetrated to CIWS range of the destroyer was also 2.8 nautical miles from a 100,000-ton vessel carrying 5,000 personnel and enough aviation fuel to produce secondary effects that no one wanted to calculate. At 2:19 a.m., 15 minutes after the escort assignment was confirmed, the SPY-6 resolved 60 contacts. Bearing 294 to 321, range 64 to 72 kilometers, altitude 400 to 500 meters. 3 groups: 40 Shad 136 fixed-wing one-way attack platforms and 20 contacts at higher speed, 680 kilometers per hour, consistent with a second-generation cruise missile profile. The faster contacts were at altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 meters, high-altitude approach before terminal descent. 60 contacts, 40 slow UAVs, 20 high-speed cruise missiles. The mixed threat picture changed the engagement allocation fundamentally. The SM-6 was the only weapon in the inventory with reliable engagement capability against high-altitude, high-speed cruise missiles. The SM-2 could engage them, but with reduced probability against high-altitude contacts, transitioning to terminal dive at supersonic speed. The SM-6 had to handle the cruise missiles. The SM-2 and ESSM had to handle the UAVs. The 2 weapon categories could not share allocation without degrading performance against both. And the carrier behind the destroyer was the target, not the destroyer. Every contact in the picture was on an approach vector that passed through or over the carrier's position. The destroyer's defensive envelope covered the approach corridor, but only if the destroyer maintained its position 2.8 nautical miles off the carrier's port beam. The defensive geometry required holding position, while 5,000 people 2.8 nautical miles away waited to find out if the math worked. The TAO computed the allocation in 41 seconds. SM-6 on the high-speed contacts. All 8 cells prioritized by terminal approach vector to carrier position. SM-2 on the UAV's outer engagement. ESSM middle ring. RAM and CIWS terminal. We are not maneuvering, we hold position. Weapons free. Running count. 2:19 a.m. Second 0. 60 contacts. 40 UAV bearing 294 to 321, range 64 to 72 kilometers, 185 kilometers per hour, altitude 400 to 500 meters. 20 cruise missiles bearing 298 to 315, range 68 to 74 kilometers, 680 kilometers per hour, altitude 8,000 to 12,000 meters. Carrier 2.8 nautical miles port, Immobile, 5,000 crew, flight deck crew, emergency repair. SM-6 8, SM-2 24, ESSM 32, RAM 21, CIWS 100%. Destroyer holding position, cost $0. The SM-6 engagement against 20 cruise missiles at altitude was the first problem. The cruise missiles were at 8,000 to 12,000 meters, supersonic at 680 kilometers per hour, on what appeared to be a ballistic descent approach profile. They had not yet initiated terminal descent. The SM-6 in anti-air mode against high-altitude contacts at 68 to 74 kilometers. Engagement probability assessed at 68 to 74% per round at this altitude band and target speed. Better than against sea-skimming contacts in heavy weather, worse than against the standard anti-ship profile. 20 cruise missiles, 8 SM-6 cells. At 1 SM-6 per cruise missile, 8 intercepts at 70% probability, 5.6 expected neutralizations. 12 cruise missiles surviving the outer ring was not an acceptable outcome against a target with 5,000 personnel aboard. The Fire Control System's allocation recommendation: 8 SM-6 against the 8 highest threat cruise missiles. 12 remaining cruise missiles were to be handled by SM-2 as they descended through the middle ring. Against a supersonic cruise missile in terminal dive, the SM-2 hit probability in this configuration was assessed at 42 to 55% per round. Against 12 surviving cruise missiles using 12 SM-2 cells in single-round engagement, 5 to 6 expected additional intercepts, 6 to 7 cruise missiles surviving to ESSM range. Against the ESSM in terminal geometry, against supersonic contacts, 35% per round, 2 rounds per contact, 57% per engagement. Against 6 contacts, 4 cells, 2 to 3 expected intercepts, 3 to 4 cruise missiles surviving to CIWS range, 3 to 4 supersonic cruise missiles, each carrying a 165-kilogram warhead, arriving at the carrier's position or the destroyer's position, while the destroyer was holding 2.8 nautical miles off. This was the math. The TAO had run it in the 41 seconds before weapons free. He had not liked the answer in those 41 seconds, and he still did not like it. He had fired anyway because the alternative was not firing, and that math was worse. Running count, 2:22 a.m., second 183, TAO allocation complete. SM-6, targeting 8 of 20 cruise missiles. SM-2, 12 cells, UAV outer, 12 cells, cruise missile middle. ESSM/RAM, mixed terminal, 60 contacts at 60 to 68 kilometers. Carrier, notified, crew sheltering. Destroyer, holding position, 2.8 nautical miles off carrier port beam. Cost, $0. Time, 3 minutes. SM-6 cells 1 through 8 launched at 2:24 a.m. against 8 cruise missile contacts at 64 to 70 kilometers altitude. A rolling launch over 3.2 seconds. The system launching in pairs at 0.8-second intervals to maintain illuminator channel availability for each pair's terminal guidance. The launches were visible from the carrier's bridge. 8 missiles burning in rapid sequence, contrails curving upward and northwest against the pre-dawn dark. The sounds arriving at the carrier, 2.8 nautical miles away, as a sequence of low, heavy impacts through the deck. Crew on the carrier's bridge later described it as the most reassuring sound of the engagement. The destroyer was still fighting. Running count, 2:25 a.m., second 364, SM-60, SM-224, ESSM-32, RAM-21, CIWS 100%, 8 SM-6 in flight versus cruise missiles, 40 UAVs at 57 to 64 kilometers closing, 12 cruise missiles unengaged, SM-6 coverage 8 of 20, carrier holding, flight deck repair ongoing, time to SM-2 UAV range 6 minutes, time to cruise missile, middle ring 4 minutes, cost $16.8 million. SM-6 results at 2:26 a.m., 6 intercepts, 2 misses. The 2 missed cruise missiles had executed final course corrections inside the SM-6 terminal basket, an active radar seeker in the cruise missile, conducting terminal maneuvering as the SM-6 closed. 18 cruise missiles remaining, now descending from altitude and accelerating into their terminal dive phase. 18 cruise missiles, plus 40 UAVs. The SM-2 allocation had to split across both threat types simultaneously. The cruise missiles descending from altitude required SM-2 engagement in the 30 to 50 kilometer band. The UAVs were at 50 to 58 kilometers, also closing toward SM-2 range. Both threat types were entering the SM-2 engagement zone at approximately the same time from slightly different altitudes and speeds. SM-2 split. 12 cells against the descending cruise missiles, 12 cells against the UAV lead element. Fire. SM-2 cells, 1 through 12 against 12. Cruise missiles in terminal descent at 28 to 46 kilometers. 7 intercepts, 5 misses. The 5 misses were distributed. 3 cruise missiles executing maneuvers that placed them outside the SM-2 terminal basket. 2 contacts whose descent angle exceeded the SM-2's optimal engagement geometry as they went supersonic in their terminal phase. 11 cruise missiles remaining, altitude declining through 4,000 to 2,000 meters. SM-2 cells 13 through 22 against 10. UAVs at 34 to 44 kilometers. 7 intercepts, 3 misses. SM-2 cells 23 and 24, the last 2 SM-2, against 2 more cruise missiles at 24 kilometers, altitude 1,200 meters, both in terminal supersonic dive toward the carrier's position. 1 intercept, 1 miss. SM-2 inventory, 0. Running count, 2:31 a.m., second 720. SM-6, 0. SM-2, 0. 10 cruise missiles at 12 to 20 kilometers, terminal dive. 37 UAVs at 18 to 28 kilometers. Carrier, emergency alert transmitted, crew below decks. ESSM-32, RAM-21, CIWS 100%. Cost $44.4 million. Time 12 minutes. 10 cruise missiles remaining. 37 UAVs remaining. Running count, 2:30 a.m., second 671, SM-6, 0. SM-2, 0. 10 cruise missiles at 12 to 20 kilometers, terminal dive. 37 UAVs at 22 to 38 kilometers. ESSM 32, RAM 21, CIWS 100%, carrier 2.8 nautical miles, unknown damage state, crew below decks per TAO emergency notification, cost $44.4 million, time 11 minutes. The TAO had transmitted an emergency notification to the carrier at 2:28 a.m. when the cruise missile count became clear. All non-essential crew below the main deck, maximum watertight integrity. The carrier's commanding officer had acknowledged and implemented. The 5,000 crew members were now below the waterline or in interior spaces. The flight deck repair teams had halted work and gone to shelter. For the next 6 minutes, the carrier was waiting. ESSM cells 1 through 16 against 16 contacts, 8 cruise missiles in their final approach, and 8 UAVs at 14 to 20 kilometers. The allocation between the two threat types was driven by which contacts presented the most direct vector to the carrier versus the destroyer. Cruise missiles with approach vectors targeting the carrier's hull amidships received priority. UAVs on bearing arcs that would pass over the destroyer's position before reaching the carrier received lower priority. 11 intercepts, 5 misses from 16 ESSM. 3 cruise missiles and 2 UAVs surviving into the inner ring. ESSM cells 17 through 26 against the remaining UAVs at 8 to 14 kilometers. 7 intercepts, 3 misses. ESSM inventory, 16 cells remaining. The 3 surviving cruise missiles were the engagement-defining problem. At 185 kilometers per hour in their terminal phase, they had entered the CIWS engagement zone simultaneously with several UAV contacts. The CIWS mounts had to sequence between high-speed cruise missiles and slower UAVs. A sequencing problem compounded by the fact that the cruise missiles' terminal dive geometry brought them in at steep angles that required the CIWS to elevate significantly, while the UAVs were approaching at lower altitudes requiring barrel depression. RAM cells 1 through 9 against 9, contacts at 4 to 7 kilometers, split between the last cruise missiles and the UAVs. 5 intercepts, 4 misses, 2 cruise missiles and 2 UAVs inside 3 kilometers. 2 of those 4 contacts were bearing directly toward the carrier's position. Running count: 2:34 a.m., second 900, RAM 12 remaining, ESSM 16, SM6 0, SM2 0. 4 contacts at 2.1 to 2.8 kilometers, 2 cruise missiles targeting carrier approach, 2 UAVs, CIWS 4 and aft, 100%. Carrier 2.8 nautical miles, crew sheltered. Cost, $58.9 million. Time, 15 minutes. Running count, 2:35 a.m., second 964, RAM 12 remaining, ESSM 16, SM2 0, SM6 0. 4 contacts at 2.1 to 2.8 kilometers, 2 cruise missiles, 2 UAVs, 2 contacts on carrier approach bearing, CIWS 4/aft, 100%. Carrier, crew sheltered, holding. Cost, $58.9 million. Time, 16 minutes. The CIWS Forward acquired the nearest cruise missile at 2,600 meters. The contact was in a 60-degree terminal dive, altitude 280 meters, and descending, speed 750 kilometers per hour in its final approach. At this speed, the CIWS burst duration needed to be longer than standard. A faster contact required more rounds in the engagement cone to ensure sufficient hits. Burst, 1.8 seconds, 135 rounds. The contact fragmented at 2,200 meters altitude. The warhead initiated in the fragmentation cloud. At 2,200 meters, the blast was directed downward and forward toward the carrier's approach sector. The overpressure and fragmentation radius at this altitude was expanding at a rate that included the carrier's position 2.8 nautical miles away. The carrier's watch team reported the detonation as a visual event, a bright flash at roughly 2,200 meters altitude and approximately 3 nautical miles northwest, a rolling pressure wave that reached the carrier 9 seconds later and produced a brief vibration through the deck plating. Minor, manageable. CIWS aft acquired the second cruise missile at 2,900 meters, altitude 340 meters, dive angle 55 degrees, burst 2.1 seconds, 157 rounds. Contact fragmented at 2,500 meters. Warhead initiated. A second detonation, slightly higher altitude, more distant from the carrier's bearing. A second pressure wave. The carrier watch team noted it and kept their stations. CIWS forward rotated and acquired the first UAV at 2,400 meters. Standard approach altitude, 185 kilometers per hour. Burst, 0.7 seconds, 52 rounds. Fragmented at 2,100 meters. Warhead initiated. Third overpressure event reaching the carrier in the engagement's final 2 minutes, each one slightly less intense than the last, as the geometry moved the detonations points away from the optimal carrier impact bearing. The final contact, a UAV at 2,200 meters, bearing directly toward the carrier, not toward the destroyer. The CIWS forward had to engage a contact that was not approaching the ship, but was approaching the carrier 2.8 nautical miles behind the ship. The geometry required the forward mount to rotate 22 degrees aft and slightly right to place the carrier bearing contact in its engagement arc. This was not a standard anti-air engagement. The CIWS was firing past the carrier's bearing to intercept a contact aimed at the carrier. Burst, 0.9 seconds, 67 rounds. Contact fragmented at 1,700 meters. The warhead did not initiate structural fragmentation without fuse trigger. The debris field from the 1,700-meter fragmentation fell toward the ocean surface on a trajectory that placed some fragments in the water between the destroyer and the carrier. None reached the carrier. At 2:37 a.m., the SPY-6 confirmed no contacts within 5 kilometers. Both CIWS mounts returned to standby mode. The engagement was over. Running count, 2:37 a.m., second 1082, all 60 contacts, neutralized, 3 warhead detonations at altitude, 2,200 meters, 2,500 meters, 2,100 meters, 1 structural fragmentation, no detonation, at 1,700 meters. Carrier, 3 overpressure events received. Crew reported minor hull vibration, no damage. SM6, 0. SM2, 0. ESSM, 16 remaining. RAM, 12. CIWS, 4. 74%, aft, 78%. Cost, $67.3 million. Time, 18 minutes. The damage assessment on the destroyer at 4 a.m. No hull impacts, no fragment damage. The engagement had been conducted with the destroyer holding position throughout. No maneuvering, no acceleration, no defensive geometry changes. The destroyer had absorbed no physical effects from the engagement because no contact had reached the ship. All contacts had been intercepted before reaching CIWS terminal range against the ship or had been intercepted at altitude above the approach corridor. The carrier's assessment, transmitted at 3:14 a.m. No additional damage from the engagement. The 3 overpressure events from high-altitude detonations had been felt aboard the carrier, but had produced no measurable structural effects. The flight deck repair team resumed work at 3:22 a.m. First aircraft launched from the carrier at 4:41 a.m. Within the 40 to 60-minute window, the deck crew had estimated at 2:04 a.m. The magazine assessment at 4:05 a.m. SM6, 0 of 8. SM-2, 0 of 24, ESSM, 16 of 32 remaining, RAM, 12 of 21 remaining, CIWS forward 74%, CIWS aft 78%. The outer ring was gone. The middle ring was gone. The ship was operating on ESSM, RAM, and CIWS. The supply officer assembled the accounting at 6 a.m. 40 Shahed, 136 one-way attack platforms at $20,000 each, $800,000. 20 cruise missiles. The identification had been refined to a Chinese-supplied variant used by partner state forces at approximately $800,000 each, $16 million. Launch logistics and coordination, $400,000. Total adversary investment, approximately $17.2 million. U.S. munitions expended, 8 SM-6 at $2.1 million to $16.8 million. 24 SM-2 at $1.2 million to $28.8 million. 16 ESSM at $450,000 to $7.2 million. 9 RAM at $900,000 to $8.1 million. CIWS ammunition, $62,000. Total, $60.9 million. Exchange ratio, 3.5 to 1 in the adversary's favor. The third lowest exchange ratio in this analysis series, comparable to the radar decoy engagement and the radar reflector operation. The cruise missiles at $800,000 each had substantially elevated the adversary's investment, which compressed the ratio compared to pure drone engagements. But the adversary had not sent cruise missiles to be cost-efficient. They had sent cruise missiles because the carrier was worth the cost of the weapons required to potentially reach it. The strategic framing was different from any other engagement in this analysis series. Every prior engagement had been evaluated against the cost of the defensive expenditure versus the cost of the offensive platforms. This engagement had to be evaluated against the cost of the defensive expenditure versus the asset being defended. The carrier was worth $13 billion and carried an air wing of 68 aircraft, representing a further $3 to $4 billion in value, and 5,000 personnel, whose value was not quantifiable in any terms the supply officer's accounting format could capture. The adversary had invested $17.2 million attempting to reach that target. The defense had cost $60.9 million. Against a $13 billion asset with 5,000 personnel, a $60.9 million defensive expenditure represented 0.47% of the protected asset value. By any ratio that was not the cost asymmetry frame, the engagement was extraordinarily efficient. By the cost asymmetry frame, the adversary had still gotten 3.5 to 1 return on their investment. Both calculations were simultaneously true. The engagement had defended a $13 billion asset at a cost of $60.9 million. The adversary had forced the destruction of $60.9 million in U.S. interceptors at a cost of $17.2 million. Neither number told the complete story. Together, they described the operational mathematics of defending a high-value asset against a cost-asymmetric adversary. You spend more than they spend, the asset survives, and you do it again. The carrier resumed limited operations at 4:41 a.m. The destroyer held its escort position throughout. Emergency resupply transmitted at 5:28 a.m. Full VLS reload, RAM replenishment, ETA 4 days from the nearest pre-position logistics vessel. 4 days. The carrier at 6 knots on reduced propulsion would take approximately 19 days to reach the nearest friendly port under its own power. The destroyer would escort it for those 19 days. The adversary knew the carrier's speed. The adversary knew the carrier's position. The adversary knew the destroyer was the only escort. The adversary had 4 days before the destroyer's magazine was restored. The carrier had been their target the first time. It remained their target. The destroyer had 4 days to be right again.